Under the sterile glow of Boston General Hospital, Amelia Gonzalez never imagined her body would become the final thread between life and death. She had lived 30 years without fanfare, carrying burdens that bent her spine, but never broke her spirit. And yet, in one night, one breathless, rain-soaked night, her fate collided with a man whose name she knew only from headlines. It was not love that brought them together, nor destiny draped in romance, but a newborn child's fragile heartbeat and the cruel silence of a monitor threatening to stop. That was the twist. Fate demanded her milk, her warmth, her existence, saving the heir of a billionaire she had never spoken to, at the precise moment his world collapsed. Amelia had just finished a 12-hour shift, her scrubs clinging to her damp skin, her body aching from exhaustion. In the break room, the rhythmic hum of the pump was her only companion, each ounce collected for her 5-month-old son, Noah, waiting in their cramped Roxbury apartment with its peeling paint and creaking floors. She did not live in a world of indulgence. Every bottle she filled meant a meal, a diaper, a reason to keep going. Her reflection in the small mirror above the sink was not glamorous. Dark curls tied back hastily, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, a body worn thin by duty. But there was resilience there, the stubborn kind of beauty that life forged under pressure. The alarm shattered everything. Code blue. Pregnant female. Multiple trauma. Amelia froze, her heart stuttering, the pump forgotten. She knew the tone, the sharp pitch, the urgency carried in the voices rushing past the door. By the time she reached the ER, the storm outside had seeped into the hallways. Paramedics wheeled in a young woman mangled from twisted metal, her swollen belly rising above bruises, her life slipping faster than the machines could count. Doctors moved like lightning orders, barked and obeyed in seconds. They could not save her, but they could still save the child. A cut, a cry, a fragile wail filled the air as the mother's silence deepened. The newborn girl, pale and impossibly small, was whisked to NICU. Amelia followed instinctively, though she had no assigned role here. She watched as wires and tubes snaked into veins thinner than threads. Formula was tried, rejected. The baby's oxygen levels plummeted. Nurses exchanged grim looks. Words Amelia dreaded clung to the air. She won't make it. And then someone asked the unthinkable. Does anyone know a lactating mother? Someone who can try breastfeeding. Silence crashed down. Every nurse looked away, every second ticking like a countdown. Then a whisper cut through Amelia. She just had a baby. Dozens of eyes turned to her. She felt her pulse slam in her ears. For a heartbeat, she wanted to run to protect what little she had left of herself. To give her body to her son was natural, instinctive, sacred. To give it to a stranger's child meant opening a door that might never close. But the monitors screamed, the tiny body convulsed, and she saw in that moment what would haunt her forever, the helplessness of life about to vanish. "I'll do it," she whispered. They placed the baby in her arms. She was lighter than Noah had ever been, her breaths shallow as whispers. Amelia unfastened her top, pulled the infant close skin against skin, praying her body would answer. For an agonizing second, nothing happened. Then, as if destiny itself had intervened, the baby latched. The monitors steadied, the beeping slowed into rhythm, and life surged back into the tiny body. A nurse gasped, another muttered, "She's stabilizing." Amelia rocked gently. Her eyes burning with tears, she didn't wipe away. She had held fragile babies before, but never one who claimed her so completely with the simple curl of a hand against her chest. For 2 hours, she did not move. Every instinct told her this child, though not hers, was now tethered to her in a way that could never be undone. She knew the dangers of attachment, knew how easily love could become a weapon. But none of that mattered when the infant's heartbeat synced with her own. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he arrived. The sound of leather soles echoed down the sterile corridor before she saw him. A man stepped into view. Tall, broad-shouldered, his coat soaked with October rain. His dark hair clung to his forehead, his jaw tense, as if carved from stone. But it was his eyes that froze the room, haunted hollow, carrying the weight of loss, too raw to disguise. Steven Ramirez. Amelia had seen his face before, framed in glowing headlines, the visionary who built Ramirez Technologies from a cramped MIT dorm room into a billion-dollar empire. A man who commanded boardrooms, who owned entire city blocks in Boston's financial district. His world was one of luxury cars and glass towers, one she had only glimpsed from bus windows on her way to work. And yet here he was, reduced to a grieving widower, his power meaningless, against the single fact that his wife was dead. When his gaze found the NICU glass, he stopped breathing. Inside, his newborn daughter, alive against all odds, was pressed to the chest of a woman in wrinkled scrubs, her face drawn with fatigue, but lit with quiet strength. He did not rush forward. He did not shout or demand answers. He stood there frozen, watching the impossible, a stranger keeping his daughter alive when the machines had failed. Amelia looked up, feeling his presence before she registered his face. Their eyes locked, her brown ones heavy with exhaustion, his blue ones sharp with disbelief. She expected anger possession, a command to release his child. Instead, he looked like a man terrified that one wrong move might break the miracle he was witnessing. When he finally stepped inside, the air thickened. His shadow stretched until it touched the bed where she sat. His voice, low and uneven, cracked the silence. "Is she alive?" Amelia adjusted the blanket around the infant. "She's feeding. She's stable." He swallowed hard, his throat working, his gaze fixed on the fragile bundle. His lips parted, the words dragged out of him, like something foreign. "Thank you." Amelia nodded, not looking away, but her chest tightened. She wasn't doing this for him. She wasn't interested in gratitude. She was here because she could not let a baby die when she had the power to keep her alive. Yet something in the way he stood there, stripped of armor, unsettled her. Steven Ramirez, the billionaire, was nothing more than a broken man tonight. And Amelia, the nurse who counted quarters for bus fare, held the only piece of his world that still lived. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but Amelia's thoughts stormed on. She returned to the break room, pumping again, staring at the milk filling the bottle. She thought of Noah, her son, who was her reason for everything. She thought of the bills piled on her kitchen table, of the promises her ex had broken before disappearing. She thought of the baby girl, whose tiny fingers had gripped her as if she belonged to her. She pressed a hand against her chest where the warmth still lingered. She told herself this was temporary, a duty, nothing more. But deep down, a whisper she could not silence echoed, "You're already attached." Outside, Steven stood alone in the hallway, staring through the glass once more. He had arrived too late to hold his wife's hand, too late to say goodbye, too late to witness his daughter's first breath. But when he looked inside at Amelia Gonzalez, a woman whose name he did not yet know, he felt something crack open. His daughter was alive because of her, and fate, merciless and unrelenting, had only just begun weaving them together. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Amelia Gonzalez had not expected. She told herself over and over that what happened that night was temporary, that she had only offered her body because the child's life demanded it, not because she belonged in the sterile glass-walled world of Boston General's NICU any longer than her shift required. Yet every morning when she returned for rounds, her name was whispered, her presence quietly sought. Emma Ramirez, the tiny infant who had clung to her like a lifeline, was waiting. Nurses glanced at Amelia. When formula once again failed, when the infant's cries turned into shallow gasps, and without words, they ushered her forward. Each time Amelia sat down, pressed the baby against her chest, and prayed the fragile rhythm of life would continue. It was meant to be clinical, a substitution born out of necessity. But the moment Amelia felt the baby's heartbeat regulate the tiny hand curl instinctively at her skin, she knew this was no transaction. This was tethering. She left the hospital each morning with aching arms and a chest heavy not only with milk, but with the weight of knowing she could no longer pretend indifference. Noah was waiting at home, her sweet boy, and she clung to him with a fierceness born from guilt, as though overloving him could erase the bond she was quietly forming with another woman's child. Steven Ramirez moved like a shadow in those early days. Amelia would notice him at the edge of the room, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on Emma with a mixture of awe and helplessness. He rarely spoke to her directly. When he did, his words were clipped clinical, as if business etiquette could shield him from the rawness of grief. How much did she take today, he would ask. Amelia would answer with measured detail, ounces, intervals, vitals. Her tone, brisk, professional. But every now and then, their eyes met across the incubator, and something unspoken passed between them. She saw not the billionaire whose face appeared on Forbes covers, but a man unraveling, terrified that one mistake, one moment of weakness would cost him the only piece of his late wife left in the world. Amelia told herself not to look at him too long, not to notice the shadows under his eyes, the way his broad shoulders seemed to sag when he thought no one was watching. But she did notice. She noticed when he lingered after everyone else had left, when he pressed his hand against the glass of Emma's crib, as if touch through barriers was all he could manage. She noticed the tremor in his voice when he said his daughter's name aloud, as if tasting it for the first time. Emma. She noticed the silence that surrounded him, the kind of silence too heavy to carry alone. On the 6th night, the silence finally broke. Amelia had just finished nursing Emma the baby, drifting into a fragile sleep, when she realized Steven had not left, as he usually did. He remained seated across from her, his eyes tired, his jaw tight as though holding back words. "You have a son," he said quietly, not as a question, but as something he had learned in whispers from the nurses. Amelia hesitated. Talking about Noah in this place felt like exposing a wound. Still, she answered. "Noah's 5 months. Healthy. Smiles more than he cries." A small laugh escaped her despite herself, except when he doesn't. For the first time she saw Steven smile. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it softened his entire face. He leaned back slightly, studying her with an intensity that made Amelia's pulse quicken. "You make it sound simple," he murmured. "I don't know how to do any of this." His confession startled her. Here was a man who built empires, who bent markets to his will, admitting that he was lost in the face of a child barely bigger than his hand. Amelia met his gaze steadily, the honesty in his voice piercing her defenses. Parenting isn't about knowing everything, she said. It's about showing up, holding them, letting them know you're there even when you're terrified you're not enough. He listened, as if her words were scripture, his guarded facade cracking further. That night, for the first time, he held Emma longer than the doctors required. His hands shook, but Amelia guided him, adjusting the way he cradled her, showing him how to read the little sounds she made. She did not comfort him with platitudes. She gave him instruction firm and steady, the way she had learned to give herself permission to survive. And each time he followed her direction, she saw something shift, tiny fragments of fatherhood, anchoring themselves in a man who had believed himself incapable. Days turned into a fragile routine. Amelia would arrive for her shifts and inevitably be called to Emma's side. Steven appeared daily, always with the same stiffness, always trying and failing to disguise how much he lingered near her. Once he brought her coffee. For the night shift, he muttered awkwardly, placing the cup on the counter before retreating. She almost laughed at the absurdity. Billionaires did not bring coffee to nurses, but she accepted, sipping gratefully, while pretending her heart wasn't racing. The NICU, usually a cacophony of alarms and whispered grief, became something else for her in those days. It became the place where she found herself caught between two lives, the one she had built for Noah with scraps and sacrifice, and the one she could not avoid, with Emma and the grieving man who haunted the edges of her world. She tried to keep her heart divided, to remind herself that this was temporary, that she did not belong in Steven Ramirez's orbit. But when Emma gripped her finger with surprising strength, when Steven's gaze softened in ways that seemed unfamiliar even to him, Amelia felt lines blur that she had spent years carving. The rumors of who Steven was whispered through the staff, his empire, his fortune, the power he wielded in Boston's financial district. Amelia ignored them. She didn't care about his empire. She cared about the way he stood in silence, watching her soothe his daughter, as if memorizing every detail. She cared about the rare moments when he asked about Noah, when his voice softened enough to suggest he saw her not only as a nurse, but as a woman balancing two worlds without complaint. And yet, with every passing day, fear gnawed at her. Fear that she was allowing herself to step into a role she could not hold. Fear that her son would one day ask why she gave so much of herself to another child. Fear that Steven would wake from his grief, look at her, and see only the wrongness of it all. A nurse from Roxbury pretending to fit into the life of a man who dined with governors and sat on panels with presidents. One night, when Emma had finally fallen asleep after hours of restlessness, Amelia lingered longer than she should have. Steven was there, sitting beside the crib, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. She almost left without speaking, but something in his posture, a rawness, a quiet devastation kept her rooted. "You don't have to know everything right now," she said softly. He lifted his head, his eyes rimmed red, and for once he did not try to mask it. "I don't know how to do this without her," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Isabel. She was the center of us. She knew how to love. I don't. I only know how to work." Amelia's chest tightened. She wanted to offer comfort, but she had no practice in soothing men like him. So she offered truth instead. Love isn't a skill you master. It's presence. It's choosing to stay, even when you don't know how. He held her gaze, and in that moment, Amelia felt the ground shift beneath them. It was not romantic, not yet. It was something raw, an unspoken understanding that two broken people had collided, tethered by a child who demanded their best when both felt they had nothing left to give. Outside the hospital, life continued with its indifference. Boston's streets buzzing with late-night taxis, the harbor glinting under the October moon. But inside, under harsh lights and hushed monitors, Amelia and Steven were changing in ways neither could admit. She left that night with Noah's stroller squeaking against the sidewalk, her hands shaking, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that she was no longer invisible in his world. He had looked at her, not as the nurse who had filled a medical necessity, not as a convenient substitute, but as a woman who held his child as if she belonged. And though Amelia tried to silence the voice rising inside her, she could not ignore it. This was no longer just survival. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous, something that had the power to heal or destroy them both. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. The NICU no longer hummed with alarms of crisis the way it had that first night, yet tension remained a quiet reminder of how close Emma had come to slipping away. Amelia Gonzalez told herself she was only doing her duty, that every time she held the child pressed against her chest, it was an extension of her oath as a nurse, nothing more. But lies whispered to oneself are the easiest to unravel. She could feel the pull each time Emma's fragile fingers curled against her skin, each time the monitors found their rhythm at the sound of the infant's breath against her body. Days folded into one another, and the boundaries Amelia had sworn to protect became porous. She still returned home to Noah each morning, rocking him against her, as sunlight filtered through the blinds of their tiny Roxbury apartment, whispering promises of stability she wasn't certain she could keep. Yet even in those sacred hours, she carried another heartbeat in her chest. When Noah laughed, she remembered Emma's faint coo. When Noah cried, she thought of Emma's silence and how she fought so desperately just to breathe. Guilt pressed on her from all sides, but affection does not divide it, multiplies often against reason. Steven Ramirez haunted the edges of those days, like a shadow unwilling to leave the light. He came often, not with the command of a man who ruled skyscrapers, but with the hesitance of someone learning how to exist again. He no longer asked only clinical questions. Instead, he hovered listening when Amelia murmured to Emma, studying the way she adjusted her hold, how her voice calmed what even machines could not. He began to follow her instructions, without argument, feeding positions. Skin contact, the delicate art of holding a child too small for this world. She watched him learn, fumbling at first, then gradually steadying, and there were moments she forgot who he was outside these walls. In the quiet of the NICU, he was not a billionaire, not a name that stirred envy or awe. He was simply a father, desperate and raw, searching for someone to show him how not to fail. But even as those days offered small reprieves, the inevitable question loomed: what happens when Emma is discharged? The thought stalked Amelia as she walked hospital corridors, as she balanced charts against her hip, as she washed her hands until her skin cracked. The board discussed home care nannies specialists, as though Emma were a puzzle to be solved with resources. And she knew, with the cold clarity, that nurses learn too soon, that no matter the qualifications on paper, the baby would fight against strangers. Emma had chosen her. On the 9th day, exhaustion had carved itself into Amelia's bones. She sat in the break room sipping coffee that had long turned lukewarm when the door opened. She looked up, startled, to see him there. Steven, out of place in his tailored suit, shoulders broad against the fragile backdrop of lockers and vending machines. He held himself with the stiffness of a man unused to entering spaces not designed for him. For a long moment, he said nothing, only studying her, as if searching for words that wouldn't sound absurd. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost rough. "I can't take her home alone." Amelia blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. He stepped further inside the door, clicking shut behind him, his presence filling the small room. "They're preparing the papers. She's almost ready. But I don't know how to do this. I don't trust nannies. I don't trust strangers." And his voice broke uncharacteristically vulnerable. She only takes from you. Her chest tightened. She placed the cup down, forcing her voice steady. She'll adapt. Babies do. She'll learn. He shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. Maybe she can, but I can't. Every time I watch you with her, it's the only moment I can breathe. The only moment I'm not failing her. He took a breath, and the next words fell like stones into still water. Come with us, to the house, just for a month, maybe two, until she's stronger. The room seemed to tilt. Amelia gripped the edge of the table, heat rushing to her face. That's not, she began, but he cut her off. I'll pay you double. I'll cover daycare for your son. You'll have your own space. I'm not asking for anything else. Just help me keep her alive. She stared at him, every instinct warring inside her. The offer was obscene in its scale. Her entire life, she had scraped by counting quarters for bus fare, clipping coupons for diapers, while here stood a man offering solutions in a single breath. Yet it wasn't the money that caught her, not truly. It was the way his eyes looked at her, not with ownership, not with arrogance, but with desperation he couldn't disguise. Still, she shook her head, forcing steel into her spine. I can't blur those lines. I'm her nurse, nothing more. Nothing more. His gaze darkened, though, not with anger, with something closer to grief. Do you really believe that? Look at her. She's alive because of you. You're not nothing. The words struck deeper than she wanted them to. She thought of Noah, of the long nights she had whispered to him, that he would never feel abandoned the way she once had. She thought of promises she'd made to herself, that she would never again allow a man, a system, a need, to dictate her worth. And yet here she was, caught in the eyes of a man whose world could swallow her whole. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I need time. He didn't stop her, didn't follow. He only nodded once, as though he knew he had already said too much. That night in the small apartment where the radiator rattled and Noah's laughter echoed against the thin walls, Amelia rocked her son to sleep and felt the weight of two lives pressing against her chest. She told herself it was madness to consider it, madness to step into the mansion of a man whose face belonged on financial magazines, whose name was synonymous with power. But then she remembered Emma's fragile grip, the way her cries softened only when Amelia held her, and madness no longer seemed so easy to define. 2 days later, the decision was made for her. Emma refused every bottle the nurses tried. Her oxygen dipped, her cries cracked into silence. The attending physician looked at Amelia with quiet resignation. If she goes home, it has to be with you. So Amelia found herself standing before the iron gates of a Beacon Hill estate, Noah's stroller beside her, her pulse pounding like a drum she could not silence. The mansion loomed above all glass and stone, its windows reflecting the harbor like mirrors meant to intimidate. She had never been inside a home like this, not even in her wildest imaginings. Noah cooed, tugging at the edge of his blanket, blissfully unaware of the world his mother was about to enter. The doors opened, and Steven was there, dressed down in a simple shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking less like a billionaire and more like a man who had not slept in weeks. His gaze dropped to Noah, first surprise flickering across his face, then rose to meet hers. For a long moment they said nothing, the gulf between their lives yawning wide. Then he stepped aside, his voice quiet. Welcome home. Inside, the silence was overwhelming. Marble floors, high ceilings, art that belonged in museums. Yet it felt hollow, as though every corner still carried the echo of a woman now gone. Steven led them through winding halls to a guest wing prepared with unsettling precision, a nursery for Emma, a play area for Noah, even a kitchenette stocked with formula and diapers. Amelia felt disoriented, as though she had stepped into someone else's dream. That first night was clumsy. Meals eaten in silence, Noah fussing at the change of environment, Emma stirring at unfamiliar shadows. Amelia moved through the motions, professional detached, refusing to acknowledge the undercurrent humming between them. But later, when she found Steven alone in the kitchen, sleeves pushed back as he struggled with a bottle warmer, she could not stop the laugh that slipped past her lips. He looked up, startled, and for a moment, the weight on his shoulders lightened. She showed him how to swirl the milk gently, how not to overheat it, her fingers brushing his as she handed it back. Something cracked open in that moment, not a declaration, not even recognition, but a fragile awareness. Two worlds had collided, and though neither belonged in the other, both were now bound by a child whose survival depended on them. Amelia retreated to her room that night, Noah asleep in his crib, and stared at the ceiling, while her heart whispered truths she wasn't ready to name. She was no longer just the nurse, and this house, for all its silence, no longer belonged solely to grief. Something new had begun to take root, fragile and dangerous, waiting for the courage of two broken people to see it through. The mansion at Beacon Hill was nothing like Amelia Gonzalez had ever known, yet it became her reluctant stage. She walked its wide corridors with Noah balanced on her hip, her sneakers whispering against marble floors, polished to the kind of gleam that reflected her unease. The ceilings arched above her like the vaults of cathedrals, chandeliers dripping crystal light that made even silence feel ostentatious. And in the midst of all that grandeur, she felt small too, aware of her second-hand clothes, of the baby food stains she could never quite scrub from her sleeves, of the creak in Noah's stroller wheel that echoed like a reminder she did not belong. At first, she resolved to keep her distance. She told herself she was here only for Emma, that her days would be measured in feeding schedules and nap times, not in the man who drifted in and out of the house like a restless ghost. Steven Ramirez was courteous, unfailingly so, but there was a gravity in the way he lingered that unsettled her. He did not crowd her, did not intrude, yet. She often felt his eyes on her, when she bent over Emma's crib, when she calmed Noah's fussing with a lullaby, when she sat on the rug with both children in her lap, as if she were anchoring the entire house. Meals were the most difficult. They sat across from each other at the long oak dining table, plates set down by staff who vanished almost immediately, leaving silence to stretch between them. Steven would eat sparingly, his fork moving more from habit than appetite, while Amelia tried to coax Noah into his high chair and keep Emma settled in her cradle nearby. Sometimes she caught him watching, not rudely, but with the bewildered curiosity of a man studying something he did not understand. Once, when Noah reached across the table for his cup, and Amelia's hand instinctively darted out to steady him, Steven's lips curved almost imperceptibly, as though surprised by the tenderness of such a small act. Nights became the most fragile time. The house, vast and echoing, seemed lonelier when the children slept. Amelia would retreat to the guest wing, reading medical notes or singing softly to Noah, pretending she could forget the weight of the man just down the hall. But she could not ignore the sounds, his footsteps pacing the floor, above his low voice on late phone calls, the clatter of glass when he thought no one would hear. He carried his grief like armor, heavy and impenetrable, and yet the cracks were visible to anyone who cared to look. It was on one of those nights when the house seemed almost too still that their fragile distance broke. Amelia had just lulled Noah into sleep when Emma's cries pierced the quiet. She hurried to the nursery, finding Steven already there. His broad shoulders hunched, his hands clumsy, as he tried to soothe the infant. The bottle warmer sat on the counter, the milk far too hot, steam fogging the glass. He cursed under his breath, frustration carved deep into his face. "Here," Amelia said gently, stepping forward, before he could react. She took the bottle, cooling it quickly in cold water, swirling it the way she had shown him before. He stood back, watching her with an expression that carried more weariness than pride. When she tested the temperature against her wrist and nodded, she offered it to him instead of taking Emma. "You try. She needs to know it's you." He hesitated, then reached out. His large hands dwarfed the bottle, yet he took it carefully, his movements deliberate, as though the slightest error might shatter the child. Amelia guided his arms, adjusted his posture, whispered encouragement, until finally Emma latched and drank. Steven exhaled, shoulders slumping as relief softened his features. "See," she murmured, "she knows you." He looked at her, then really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more dangerous, recognition perhaps, or the beginnings of trust. He did not thank her. He didn't need to. The silence carried enough. From that night forward, a shift began. He lingered longer in the nursery, sometimes staying after Amelia had already put Noah to bed, asking questions that had nothing to do with vitals or feeding schedules. What had Noah's first laugh sounded like? What lullabies did she sing when exhaustion threatened to swallow her? Did she ever feel like she was failing, even when everyone else told her she was strong? She answered cautiously at first, unwilling to bear too much of herself. But his questions did not feel like interrogation. They felt like a man reaching for a language he had forgotten. Once, after a particularly long night, when Emma's cries had refused to cease, Amelia found herself in the kitchen at dawn, hair disheveled, robe pulled hastily around her. She was startled to see Steven there, sleeves rolled up, flipping pancakes with an awkward determination. He looked up at her, embarrassed, as though caught in an act he had no right attempting. "Noah likes these, doesn't he?" he asked. She blinked, then nodded, watching as he plated the uneven stack with a sheepish shrug. "I thought maybe it would help. Start the morning better." It did. Noah giggled through sticky bites. Emma dozed contentedly in her bassinet. And for the first time since she had entered this house, Amelia felt something shift inside her. The mansion did not feel like a mausoleum anymore. It felt fleetingly like a home. And yet, Amelia knew how fragile the illusion was. She told herself every night that this was temporary. She repeated it like a mantra, a shield against the warmth blooming where she couldn't afford it. Steven belonged to a world of glass towers and gilded boardrooms. She belonged to crowded bus rides and late-night double shifts. Their paths had crossed by accident, stitched together by tragedy, but paths like theirs did not merge for long. She reminded herself of the pain of Noah's absent father, of promises that evaporated into silence, of the way love could abandon without warning. She would not allow herself to mistake proximity for permanence. But hearts are stubborn things. They listen not to logic, but to presence. They pay attention to the way his hand brushed against hers when they both reached for Emma's blanket, to the sound of his voice softening when he told Noah a story he clearly invented on the spot, to the rare moments when his laughter broke free, unpolished, and real. Amelia found herself noticing him, not just as a father, but as a man, the cut of his jaw when he bent over Emma, the gentleness hidden in his large hands, the haunted beauty of someone who had lost and yet still tried to give. One evening, as autumn winds rattled the windows, Amelia sat with Emma against her chest, humming softly. Steven entered quietly holding 2 glasses of wine, an awkward offering. "You look like you could use this," he said. She hesitated, then accepted, sipping carefully as he lowered himself into the chair across from her. For a long time, they said nothing, only the sounds of the baby's steady breathing, filling the space. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't remember the last time this house felt alive." Her chest tightened. She wanted to respond, to remind him that grief could coexist with life, that love was not about replacing, but about enduring. But words failed her. Instead, she met his gaze, and in the stillness of that moment, something cracked open between them. Not a declaration, not yet. Just an understanding that the walls of silence around them were beginning to crumble. That night, when she returned to her room, Amelia pressed her palm against her heart as if to steady it. She told herself again that this was temporary, that she was here for Emma and Noah, not for the man down the hall. But as she lay awake listening to the muffled sound of his footsteps pacing upstairs, she could no longer deny the truth pressing in from all sides. Something was changing. Slowly, dangerously, inevitably. And though she feared it with every part of her that had ever been broken, she also knew she could not turn away. The first true fracture in their fragile rhythm came on a bright Sunday afternoon when the house was unusually alive with sound. Noah's laughter carried down the wide halls, shrill and unrestrained, as he toddled across the living room rug, with Emma's rattle clutched in his fist. Emma lay on her back nearby, her tiny legs kicking, as Amelia leaned over her, coaxing her to roll. For a moment the mansion felt unrecognizably warm, filled with giggles, coos, and the low murmur of Amelia's voice. Steven entered from the kitchen, holding 2 mugs of coffee. His sleeves rolled up, a smile tugging at his lips at the sight. He looked less like the man who once commanded headlines, and more like a father, stumbling his way into ordinary joy. Amelia caught his eye and allowed herself the smallest smile, her heart betraying her by softening where it should have stayed guarded. The knock at the door shattered that peace. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that belonged to someone who never asked permission to enter. Amelia froze where she knelt, her body instinctively curling around Emma. Steven set the mugs down, his jaw tightening, as he moved toward the foyer. She heard the low murmur of voices, the clipped cadence of his replies, and then the echo of heels against marble. When Margaret Sinclair stepped into the living room, Amelia knew instantly who she was. The older woman carried herself with the polished confidence of Boston's old money, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored coat, her hair swept into a style that whispered of salons and generational wealth. She did not look at Amelia at first. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, fell immediately on the baby. Her expression softened, though not with warmth. It was the kind of softness reserved for possessions, something fragile to be protected, but never truly loved. "Emma," Margaret said, her voice smooth as silk stretched taut. "My sweet girl." She bent down, brushing a manicured hand across the child's cheek. Only then did her gaze flick to Amelia, and the temperature of the room dropped. Steven returned, his tone measured. "Mother, this isn't the time." "On the contrary," Margaret replied, straightening to her full height. "I think it's precisely the time. I wanted to see my granddaughter, and I wanted to know why she's lying on the floor in the care of this woman." The disdain in her voice cut like glass. Amelia rose slowly, Noah clutching her leg, Emma still resting on the blanket at her feet. She kept her posture calm, her voice even. "I'm the nurse who's been caring for Emma since birth." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Yes, I've heard of you. Quite the story, isn't it? The nurse who stepped in at the right moment. How fortunate. Her smile was thin, laced with implication. And now you live here. Before Amelia could reply, Steven interjected, his voice harder than usual. She's here because Emma trusts her. Because she saved her life. Margaret's gaze flicked to her son-in-law, her lips curving into something close to pity. Oh, Steven, you've always been too easily swayed by emotion. First Isabel. Now this. Do you truly believe this arrangement is appropriate? Amelia felt the words like a blade pressed against her skin, but she kept her chin high. She would not flinch. She would not allow this woman to see the tremor in her chest. Margaret, Steven said firmly, "This isn't your decision." The older woman's expression did not waver. Perhaps not legally, but don't think for a moment I will stand by while my granddaughter is raised in confusion. A nurse living under your roof, her own child, toddling about playing house as though she belongs. People will talk. They already are. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Amelia bent to pick up Emma, holding her close, not to shield the baby from Margaret, but to steady herself. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but sure. I'm here because Emma needed me. That's all. Margaret's smile tightened. Let's not pretend, dear. Men like Steven don't keep women like you around without expectation. The words landed with surgical precision designed to wound. Amelia's stomach twisted, but she refused to show it. She turned to Steven, waiting for him to refute the implication, but he said nothing. His jaw clenched, his silence louder than any denial. The conversation ended there, Margaret, sweeping from the room, with the same authority she had carried in. The echo of her heels faded, but the damage remained. Amelia excused herself quickly, retreating to the guest wing with both children. Once the door closed behind her, her composure cracked. She rocked Emma in her arms. Noah pressed against her side and tried to ignore the tremble in her hands. She had endured insults before, from patients, from colleagues, from strangers, who thought her brown skin and her weary eyes made her easy to diminish. But something about Margaret's words burrowed deeper, because a part of Amelia feared they were true. That night, when Steven came to the guest wing, he found her sitting in the rocking chair, Emma asleep against her chest, Noah curled up on the bed beside her. She did not look up when he entered. Amelia, he began softly, but she cut him off. You didn't deny it. He faltered. What? When she said I was here because of expectation, you didn't deny it. Her voice cracked, but she forced it steady. Do you know what that sounded like to me, to her? That silence was agreement. He stepped closer, his expression pained. I didn't agree. I just what she demanded, finally meeting his eyes. Just thought it was easier to stay quiet. Do you know what that silence does to me? To my son, I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen as more than temporary. And today, in front of her, you made me invisible. He reached for her, but she pulled back, shaking her head. I can't do this, Steven. Not like this. Not in a house where my worth is questioned, and you let the question linger. The resignation in her tone was final. The next morning, she handed him a letter folded neatly. He read it silently, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. When he looked up, his voice was rough. Is this really what you want? It's what I need, she said simply. For Noah, for myself. I was never supposed to stay this long. He opened his mouth to argue, but she stopped him with a raised hand. Please don't make this harder. 2 days later, she was gone. Back in her small apartment, the walls seemed to close in, the radiator groaning, the ceiling water-stained. Noah adjusted quickly, his laughter returning, as though nothing had changed. But Amelia felt hollow. She missed Emma's tiny fingers, the weight of her against her chest. She missed the way the mansion had begun to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. And though she hated herself for it, she missed Steven, the quiet sound of his laughter, the way his presence had begun to settle into her life, like something she hadn't realized she wanted. She told herself it was better this way, that lines had to be redrawn before they blurred beyond recognition. Yet every time her phone buzzed with a new message from Steven unread and waiting, she felt the ache of what might have been. For his part, Steven spiraled in silence. The mansion returned to its former emptiness, filled with the sterile efficiency of rotating nannies who never lasted more than a week. Emma cried more, slept less, her small body rejecting the strangers who tried to comfort her. Steven canceled meetings, avoided social gatherings, isolating himself in the nursery, where he sat, night after night, cradling his daughter with hands that still felt clumsy, whispering words he didn't believe. He had thought Amelia's absence would be bearable, that it was her help, her convenience, her timing he missed. But as days stretched into weeks, he realized the truth with painful clarity. It wasn't the help he longed for. It was her. Late one evening, when the house was dark except for the glow of a single lamp, in the nursery, he picked up his phone. The screen displayed her name in old messages unanswered. For the first time, he typed without calculation, without restraint. "Emma misses you." He stared at the words, debating whether to delete them, but then pressed send. It was not strategy. It was truth. Across town, Amelia sat at her kitchen table, bills spread before her, Noah asleep in the next room. When the message appeared, she froze. She read it once, twice, 3 times, her heart twisting with every repetition. She should have ignored it. She should have protected herself. Instead, she typed back, her fingers trembling. "I miss her too. And you?" The reply came almost instantly. "Come over, just for a visit. No expectations. Please." Amelia closed her eyes, her chest tightening with fear and longing. She thought of Margaret's words, of Steven's silence, of the way her heart had betrayed her in that Beacon Hill kitchen over a glass of wine. And still, the next morning, she packed Noah's bag and drove toward the house she had promised herself she would never return to. The iron gates opened. Steven stood at the door, Emma in his arms. The baby squealed at the sight of her, reaching with both hands. Amelia took her, instinctively pressing her close, tears stinging her eyes. She felt Steven watching her, his expression unreadable. But when he finally spoke, his voice was low, certain. "I've been trying to do this without you. I thought I could. But I can't." Amelia's heart pounded. "What do you want from me, Steven?" He stepped closer, his eyes fierce in their honesty. "Not help, not pity. You. I want you here, because when you're here, this feels like home." Her breath caught her arms, tightening around Emma. For a moment, the world fell silent except for the rhythm of the child's heartbeat. And though fear still clung to her, though doubt whispered of everything that could break, she felt the walls around her heart tremble. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum when Amelia stepped through its doors again, but it did not yet feel like home either. The air carried the weight of words unspoken, of silences that had stretched too far, of wounds still raw beneath the surface. Steven stood there with Emma in his arms, his shoulders squared as though bracing himself for battle, yet his eyes betrayed him. They were red-rimmed, unsteady, filled with the exhaustion of sleepless nights and the terror of nearly losing everything. Amelia felt Noah press against her leg, tugging her coat, but her gaze remained locked on Steven's, caught between the ache of what she had run from and the pull of what she had returned to. "I can't do this without you," he had said. The words reverberated in her chest, dangerous in their simplicity. He had not spoken like a man who built empires, but like one who had finally stripped himself bare. Amelia drew a breath, steadying herself as Emma squirmed in her arms, nestling into her chest with the familiarity of a child who still remembered. Tears threatened, but she willed them back. "I'm scared, Steven," she whispered, the confession pulled from a place she rarely revealed. "I've been left before. Lied to. I can't walk into something that will break me again." He moved closer, his steps measured like a man approaching fragile glass. "I can't promise perfection," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with truth. "But I can promise I won't be silent again. I see you, Amelia. Not as someone temporary, not as someone filling a gap. You're not a replacement. You're the reason this house isn't collapsing in on itself. You're the reason Emma still smiles. You're the reason I'm breathing at all." She closed her eyes, clutching the infant tighter, letting the weight of his words wash over her. When she opened them again, something inside her had shifted. Not healed, not whole, but softened enough to whisper, "Okay." That night, she did not leave. She tucked Noah into the crib prepared weeks earlier, rocked Emma until her cries softened, and sat in the dim glow of the nursery while Steven lingered in the doorway, unwilling to break the fragile peace. They spoke little, but when their eyes met across the room, there was a quiet acknowledgement they were choosing for the first time, not survival, but something more dangerous, the hope. Days unfolded cautiously. Amelia moved through the mansion with deliberate steps, careful not to let the warmth creeping back into her veins become expectation. She reminded herself constantly that this was precarious, that it could crumble with one misstep, one silence too long. Yet she could not ignore the way Steven changed. He rose earlier, joining her in the kitchen, where Noah babbled in his high chair and Emma gurgled in her bassinet. He tried sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising grace, to share the small moments of domesticity he had once thought beneath him. He burned pancakes, miscalculated diaper sizes, and carried both babies through the living room as though sheer will could make him strong enough to carry the weight of a new life. And in those moments, Amelia began to see him differently. Not as the man on magazine covers, not as the billionaire whose very name intimidated, but as a father, learning clumsily, a man rebuilding with pieces of himself he had thought lost. He laughed more, not loudly, but in soft bursts that seemed to surprise even him. He lingered in rooms where she was as though the silence of his mansion no longer frightened him if she filled it. Still, Amelia's guard remained. At night, when she lay in the guest room with Noah curled against her, she reminded herself of Margaret's words, of the way Steven had once stayed silent when she needed him most. She told herself she could not afford to believe too easily. And yet her body betrayed her, her heart racing when his hand brushed hers while passing a bottle. Her breath catching when his voice softened as he asked about her childhood, her dreams, the parts of herself she rarely gave away. The shift between them was subtle at first, but undeniable. One evening, after both children had finally drifted to sleep, Amelia found herself on the back porch, the harbor lights flickering in the distance, the night air cool against her skin. Steven joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He set one before her without a word, then leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Silence stretched, but it was not the suffocating kind they had once shared. It was companionable, steady. Finally he spoke. "Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by people who admire you, but never see you?" Amelia's lips curved into something like a bitter smile. "Every day." He looked at her, then really looked, and for a moment the weight of titles, money, grief, all of it fell away. They were just two people laid bare by the cost of being unseen. Something in his gaze made her chest ache. She looked away quickly, afraid of what might unravel if she didn't. But the unraveling had already begun. Their closeness did not go unnoticed. Staff whispered. Photographers lingered near the gates, hungry for a glimpse of Boston's most elusive billionaire, now spotted walking through public parks with a nurse and two children. When the first photo surfaced online, Steven carrying Noah on his shoulders, Amelia pushing Emma's stroller beside him, the headlines bloomed like wildfire by. Billionaire tech CEO building new family widower, Ramirez. Seen with mystery woman. The gossip was relentless, and Amelia felt its sting like acid against her skin. Her name appeared on websites, her past dissected without mercy. Old addresses, fragments of her family history, whispers about Noah's absent father, all twisted into stories that painted her as a gold digger, a social climber, a woman with designs on a fortune she had never even imagined touching. She deleted her social media, stopped leaving the house, but the stories followed her. Even on her way to the hospital for her shifts, she felt the stares, the whispers. What hurt most was not the lies themselves, but Steven's response, or rather, his lack of one. He told her to ignore it, that it would pass, that the world always tired of gossip. But Amelia was not a public figure. She had built her life in quiet corners, in sterile hospital halls, in the privacy of her son's laughter. She could not shrug off strangers dissecting her dignity. One evening, as she fed Emma, her hands shaking from the weight of it, she looked at him with eyes that demanded an answer. "Why won't you say anything? Why won't you defend me?" Steven sighed, his shoulders heavy. Because the more we feed them, the louder they get. Silence makes them move on. Her heart cracked at the words. "Silence is what breaks me, Steven. Don't you see that?" He had no answer. And in his silence, she felt the old wounds tear open again. The breaking point came when Margaret returned, not with sly barbs, but with lawyers. She demanded visitation rights for Emma, citing concerns about Steven's judgment about Amelia's influence. Amelia overheard the heated argument in the study, Margaret's voice, sharp, accusing. "She's not family. She's a liability. You're clinging to her because you're grieving, and she is convenient." Amelia stood outside the door, her breath shallow, waiting for Steven to deny it, waiting for him to declare she was not temporary, that she was chosen. But the words never came. He told Margaret to leave, his voice hard, but he did not speak the words Amelia needed most. That night she packed a bag. Not everything, just enough. She left a note on the counter, her handwriting steady, though her heart shook. "I love this family, but I cannot be anyone's replacement. If you cannot choose me fully, then don't hold me halfway." Before sunrise, she was gone again. The mansion fell silent once more. Emma cried, inconsolable, refusing the arms of nannies. Noah's laughter no longer echoed in its halls. Steven walked the corridors at night, phone in hand, staring at old messages from Amelia, unable to press send. He had thought silence was a shield. Now he knew it was a weapon, and he had turned it on the only woman who had given him back his breath. When Emma spiked her first fever days later, he broke. He called Amelia, his voice unsteady for the first time. "Please, she won't eat. She won't sleep. She cries for you. I don't know how to do this without you. I should have defended you. I should have chosen you. Please, Amelia, just 1 hour. That's all I ask." Amelia sat in her small apartment, Noah asleep in the crib beside her, the phone trembling in her hand. She wanted to hang up, to protect herself, to rebuild the walls she had so carefully constructed. But she heard Emma's cries, echoing through his voice, and her heart gave way. The next morning, she was back at the mansion, Noah in tow, Emma reaching for her with both hands, as though no time had passed. Steven stood in the doorway, his face gaunt with sleepless nights, his eyes brimming with regret. He did not speak immediately, only watched as Amelia gathered Emma into her arms, humming softly until the child relaxed. Finally, his voice broke through the quiet. I was wrong. Silence cost me more than I ever imagined. I see you, Amelia, not as a shadow, not as a stand-in. You are the woman who saved my daughter, who saved me, and I love you. Not because you filled a void, but because you stayed when you didn't have to. Amelia's heart clenched, her arms tightening around Emma. Tears stung her eyes as she looked at him, the man who had finally spoken the words she had needed all along. If we do this, Steven, it has to be all or nothing. I can't survive halfway. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as it brushed against hers. Then let's do all. No more halfway. And for the first time, she let herself believe him. The return should have felt like a balm, but peace was never meant to last, in a world where appearances ruled and whispers held more weight than truth. For a brief stretch of days, Amelia allowed herself to believe that perhaps they had finally found their rhythm. Emma thrived under her care. Noah laughed louder in the wide halls of the Beacon Hill mansion than he ever had in their cramped apartment. And Steven. God help her. Steven softened in ways she hadn't thought possible. He carried Noah on his shoulders through the garden, sang lullabies off-key, while Amelia tried not to smile and kissed Emma's forehead, as if the gesture alone could shield her from every cruelty in the world. But the outside world was always watching, waiting to tear apart what they had begun to stitch together. It started with a letter. A plain white envelope delivered not to Steven's office but to Amelia's hand one morning by a hospital courier who could not meet her eyes. Inside was a single page stamped with the insignia of the Massachusetts Board of Nursing. She read the words once, then again, until they blurred into nothing but static in her head. Your license is under review. An anonymous complaint has been filed alleging violation of professional ethics, entering into a personal relationship with the parent of a former patient, while said patient remained under hospital care. Her hands shook. The paper slipped from her grasp and floated to the floor, Noah babbling innocently in his playpen, as if her entire life hadn't just tilted off its axis. She had survived heartbreak, poverty, abandonment. But her license, her right to heal, to save, to serve, was the one thing she had built from nothing. Without it, she was not simply unemployed. She was untethered, her entire identity questioned. Steven found her sitting on the edge of the bed. The letter crumpled in her fist, her face pale with shock. He took it from her gently, his eyes scanning the words, his jaw tightening until she thought it might shatter. It's her, he said, finally, his voice like gravel. Margaret. She's behind this. Amelia pressed her palms to her temples. It doesn't matter who sent it. What matters is they'll investigate. They'll dig through everything. And when they find out I've been living here. Her voice broke. Even if I'm innocent, even if what I did was for Emma's life, people will believe what they want, and I'll lose everything. Steven dropped to his knees before her, his hands gripping hers with a desperation that startled her. Then we'll fight. I'll bring in lawyers, PR, whatever it takes. I won't let them take this from you. She shook her head fiercely. This isn't about money or power. You can't buy my integrity back once it's stained. Do you understand? If they decide I crossed a line, my name will never be clean again. His expression faltered, pain flickering in his eyes. For once, he had no immediate solution. He was a man who solved problems with checks and contracts, yet here was something he could not control. And Amelia, trembling and furious, realized how terrifying it was to stand on the edge of losing the one piece of herself she had always trusted. The days that followed were a nightmare of waiting. She was placed on temporary leave, her shifts at Boston General. Frozen, her colleagues questioned, families of former patients contacted. The media latched onto the story with cruel efficiency, twisting it into scandal. Nurse entangles herself with billionaire widower. Headlines speculated motives, painted her as manipulative, painted Steven as reckless. Amelia shut herself inside the house, avoiding windows, deleting every trace of her online presence. She hated the whispers, but what gutted her more was the look on Noah's face when he saw her crying in the kitchen, when she tried to smile for him and failed. Steven became relentless in his support, though his efforts often collided with her fear. He offered to take her away, to whisk her and the children to a secluded estate in Cape Cod until the storm passed. But Amelia refused. "If I run, I look guilty. I won't hide. Not from them, not from myself." One night as she sat in the nursery rocking Emma, she whispered broken words into the child's hair. "I did everything right. I saved you. I loved you. And now they want to strip away the only thing I have left." She didn't realize Steven was in the doorway until his shadow stretched across the room. He came forward, silently took Emma from her arms and held her close, his large hands trembling. "You won't lose it," he said hoarsely. "If the world can't see you for who you are, then I'll remind them, loudly, publicly. I'll burn down every lie until the truth is all that's left." True to his word, the next morning he released a statement not crafted by publicists, not filtered by lawyers, but raw, unpolished, and devastatingly human. On every platform tied to his empire, he wrote of how Amelia had saved Emma not once, but over and over, how she had refused special treatment, how she had given of herself when there was nothing to gain. He admitted his own silence had been a mistake, that he had failed to defend her when she needed it most. And he ended with words that spread across the internet within hours, igniting both outrage and awe. "She was never the nurse who fell for a billionaire. She is the woman who taught a broken man how to be a father." The backlash shifted. Nurses, mothers, doctors, former patients. Voices poured in with stories of Amelia's kindness, her tireless work, her quiet heroism. The narrative twisted against Margaret's intent, yet the investigation still loomed clinical and unforgiving. For 2 weeks, Amelia lived suspended in uncertainty, her nights restless, her days consumed by the gnawing fear that even truth might not be enough. When the verdict finally arrived, she almost couldn't open the envelope. Steven stood beside her in the study, his hand covering hers, as she slit the paper with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the words, disbelief flooding in waves. Cleared. No suspension, no violation found. Her actions deemed rooted in medical necessity, compassion, and integrity. The paper fell from her hand, and for the first time in weeks, her body shook not from fear, but from release. Steven caught her as she collapsed into him, his arms wrapping around her with a ferocity that nearly undid her. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "You're free." But Amelia knew she was not the same. Even victory left scars. She had survived the doubt of strangers, but the memory of it lingered, a reminder that even when you gave everything, the world could still question your worth. That night, Steven took her out, not to a gala or a public display, but to a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking the harbor. The city lights shimmered below the air, crisp with the scent of salt water and autumn. As they ate, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. Her breath caught, but he opened it, not to reveal a ring, but a simple silver key on a chain. "Before you think this is more than it is," he said gently, "it isn't a proposal. Not yet. This is me asking if you're ready to stop saying, maybe. I don't want you to feel like a guest in my life anymore. This is your home too, if you'll have it." Amelia stared at the key, her heart swelling and breaking at once. She thought of Noah asleep in the guest wing of Emma, who reached for her with instinctive trust of the battles she had fought and the truths she had earned. She looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm not afraid of forever, Steven. I'm afraid of almost." His hand tightened around hers. "Then let's never be almost again." The city lights glimmered like stars scattered at their feet, and for the first time, Amelia allowed herself to breathe without waiting for the next storm. She had been tested, doubted, nearly broken. But she was still standing, and beside her, a man who once lived behind walls of silence was finally learning how to speak in the only language that mattered: consistency. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't even an ending at all. But it was real. And for Amelia, who had lived too long on borrowed hope, that was more than enough. The mansion no longer echoed with silence. It was filled now with Noah's delighted squeals, with Emma's babbled attempts at words, with the soft murmur of Amelia's voice, weaving comfort into the walls. For the first time since Isabel's death, Steven would come home not to shadows, but to warmth. He would walk through the door and see Amelia bent over the children, her laughter like a ribbon, twining through the rooms, her presence steady as a lighthouse guiding him through the storm. And yet, despite the peace that had begun to take root, he knew one truth lingered. Love was not tested in moments of calm. It was tested when the world tried again to shake them apart. The press did not relent. Though Steven's letter had turned public opinion in Amelia's favor, attention still swarmed their lives. Photographers loitered near the iron gates. Rumors resurfaced with every outing they made together. No matter how ordinary, a walk to the park, a visit to the pediatrician, a simple trip for groceries. Amelia bore it with as much grace as she could, but she still flinched at whispered accusations, still fought the old instinct to retreat into invisibility. Steven held her hand in those moments, more deliberate, now no longer silent, but Amelia knew that some scars ran too deep to erase. It was Margaret, surprisingly, who delivered the first sign that not all battles would end in war. One afternoon, the older woman arrived at the mansion, unannounced again. But this time her presence was quieter. She asked to see Emma, and Amelia, after a tense pause, allowed it. Margaret cradled her granddaughter in the garden, sitting among the hydrangeas, her once sharp voice soft, as she murmured stories of Isabel's childhood. Amelia watched from the porch, wary. But something in Margaret's posture, an unfamiliar slouch of grief, a loneliness that even her wealth could not armor, made Amelia's anger falter. Later, when Margaret handed Emma back, she met Amelia's eyes. No apology came, but neither did Barb's. Only a quiet, brittle acknowledgement. "She looks happy. You're good for her." It was not a surrender, but it was the closest to peace they had ever shared. Time unfolded gently after that. Amelia returned to nursing, not as a woman broken, but as one remade. She split her time between the hospital and a nonprofit she and Steven launched together. Emma's Light, an organization that offered postpartum support to mothers who had no one. The mission became more than work. It was a testament to survival, to the power of compassion in the face of cruelty. Amelia stood at the podium during its opening gala, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with conviction, as she told her story. Steven watched from the audience, pride in his eyes, and Noah asleep against his shoulder. Emma reaching small hands toward the mother, who had taught them both what strength meant. But their love was not defined by galas or headlines. It was in the rhythm of ordinary days. It was in Steven reading bedtime stories with exaggerated voices that made Noah shriek with laughter. It was in Amelia finding him asleep in the nursery chair, Emma curled on his chest, his hand resting protectively over her tiny back. It was in shared breakfasts, where pancakes were still burned, but eaten anyway, in long walks, where their hands found each other's without thought, in evenings when they sat on the porch swing watching the sky bleed into stars, their silence no longer heavy, but content. And yet there remained one unspoken question between them, lingering like a shadow permanence. Amelia had told him once that she feared almost more than anything, and Steven had promised her no more halfway. But promises are fragile, unless given shape. On a quiet Sunday morning with the children playing in the grass of the backyard, Steven finally gave it shape. He knelt not in grandeur, but in simplicity, beside her as she watched the children chase each other clumsily. His hand brushed hers, his voice low, steady. I used to think love had to be perfect to be real, that it had to be a grand gesture, a flawless vow. But you taught me that love is what survives the storms, what stays when leaving would be easier. So I'm not asking for perfection, Amelia. I'm asking if you'll let me choose you every day for the rest of our lives. Amelia turned to him, her throat tightening. There was no ring in his hand, only the raw sincerity of his words. She thought of every moment that had led them here, the night she had saved Emma, the silence that had broken them, the battles they had survived, the scars they still carried. And then she looked at Noah, at Emma, at the life they had built, not through fantasy, but through endurance. Her eyes filled, but her voice was clear. Yes, Steven, because I already have. They did not throw a wedding in the way the world expected. There were no chandeliers, no gowns splashed across magazines. Instead, they chose a garden in spring blossoms, trembling on branches above them, their children at their side. Close friends, a handful of colleagues even, Margaret sat quietly among the small gathering. Amelia wore a simple dress, her curls left free, her hand steady in Steven's, as vows were spoken softly, words meant not for spectacle, but for survival, for truth. When he kissed her, it was not the sealing of a fairy tale, but the beginning of something far more enduring, a love that had been tested by fire and had survived. The years that followed were not without challenge. There were sleepless nights, illnesses, arguments that left both raw and stubborn. But there were also triumphs, Noah's first day of school, Emma's first wobbly steps, the growth of Emma's light into a beacon for women across the state. Through it all, they stayed. Through it all, they chose each other again and again, even when fear whispered, even when doubt tried to claw its way back in. One evening, long after the children had gone to bed, Amelia found a note slipped beneath her coffee cup. Steven's handwriting familiar now, in its untidy scrawl. You weren't the miracle. You were the one who believed we still deserved one, and you gave it to us anyway. She pressed the note to her chest, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of having been seen, truly seen. She thought of the woman she once was, exhausted, invisible, certain her life would always be defined by survival. And she thought of the woman she had become, loved, chosen, no longer afraid of, almost. Love, she realized, was never about rescue. It was about staying, about building, about enduring even when every reason to run presented itself. And as she curled against Steven that night, their hands intertwined, She knew that the life they had created together was not the one she had planned, but it was the one she had always needed. The mansion, once a monument to grief, was now filled with laughter, with the sound of children's footsteps, pounding down hallways, with the hum of a family that had been pieced together through pain, patience, and grace. And in the quiet moments when the world outside seemed far away, Amelia would look at Steven and see not the billionaire, not the widower, but the man who had learned to choose again and again. It was not a perfect story, but it was theirs, and it was enough.